Trouble is brewing. The big question: who were the Sons of Liberty, and what form of protest did they lead in Boston Harbor? Some of the most passionate protests against the Stamp Act took place in Boston, Massachusetts. There, angry crowds took their frustration out on tax collectors. A new group of protesters formed in Boston in response to the Stamp Act. The group met under a tree that they called the Liberty Tree. They made public speeches against taxes and the British government. They cried, "No taxation without representation." This group became known as the Sons of Liberty. Eventually, after much protest, the British government decided to repeal the Stamp Act in 1766. Parliament eliminated the tax on paper products, but in 1767 it replaced it with other taxes, including taxes on imported goods such as tea. These taxes were officially called the Townshend Acts. Buying, selling, even drinking tea became a political act in 1773. Teapot celebrating the repeal of the Stamp Act. Tea was a popular drink in the colonies, just as it was in Great Britain. However, many people decided they would not buy British tea if they had to pay an unfair tax, and they thought the new tax on tea was every bit as unfair as the old tax on paper. After all, the new tax had been approved by the same British Parliament in London, and there were still no representatives from the 13 colonies there. Suddenly, deciding to take a sip of tea meant something more than just having a drink. If you bought British tea, you were paying a tax and, indirectly, you were agreeing that Parliament had the right to tax the colonies. On the other hand, if you refused to buy British tea, you were making a statement of a different kind. You were saying that you did not approve of and would not accept taxation without representation. Colonists who were angry about the new tax agreed not to buy British tea, but they didn't stop there. They also visited inns and other places that sold tea and asked the owners to stop selling it. Many establishments agreed to boycott British tea. Advertisement for a Sons of Liberty meeting. Advertisement. The members of the Association of the Sons of Liberty are requested to meet at the City Hall at 1 o'clock tomorrow, being Friday, on business of the utmost importance, and every other friend to the liberties and trade of America are hereby most cordially invited to meet at the same time and place. The Committee of the Association, Thursday, New York, 16th December, 1773. Debates and protests about the British government's role in colonial affairs continued, especially in Boston. In 1768, in response to the protests about the new taxes, the British government sent soldiers to Boston to keep an eye on the Sons of Liberty. Because the British soldiers wore red uniforms, the colonists sometimes referred to them as redcoats or lobsterbacks. In March 1770, several Bostonians got into a tussle with a redcoat. The Bostonians surrounded the soldier and called him names. They threw snowballs at him, and some members of the crowd even threatened him with sticks and clubs. More British soldiers arrived on the scene. They ordered the Bostonians to go home, but the angry protesters refused. The situation became more serious when even more people poured into the streets. Soon, a crowd of 300 angry Bostonians was pressing in on the outnumbered British soldiers. Some of the Bostonians shouted at the soldiers, daring them to fire their guns. One of the Bostonians threw something at the soldiers. It may have been a snowball. It may have been a rock. Whatever it was, it hit one of the soldiers and knocked him down. Perhaps thinking his life was in danger, the soldier fired his musket. One of the Bostonians fought back, attacking the soldier with a club. After that, the other British soldiers responded. They fired into the crowd. When it was over, 5 people were dead. The Sons of Liberty were outraged. They began making speeches about the incident, which became known as the Boston Massacre. They insisted that the Bostonians had been protesting peacefully, and the British had no reason to fire on them. One of the Sons of Liberty, a man named Paul Revere, created an engraving that showed British soldiers firing into a crowd of peaceful protesters. It was not an entirely accurate picture of what had happened, but many colonists thought it was. Paul Revere's engraving of the event that became known as the Boston Massacre. The world's largest tea party. In December 1773, there was another incident in Boston. 3 ships loaded with tea were docked in Boston Harbor. The captains had orders to unload the tea so it could be sold in Boston. The Sons of Liberty refused to let this happen. They had spent a lot of time convincing the people of Boston not to buy or sell British tea. There was no way they were going to let the captains unload all that tea. The Sons of Liberty demanded the captains raise anchor and sail away. The captains weren't sure what to do, so they did not do anything. The ships sat in the harbor until the Sons of Liberty finally decided to get rid of the tea once and for all. Dressed as Native Americans, they and other members of the Patriot movement boarded the ships and threw the tea into Boston Harbor. They dumped approximately 340 chests of tea, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money, into the Atlantic Ocean. Later, this act of protest came to be known as the Boston Tea Party. Boston Tea Party. Phyllis Wheatley. When the Stamp Act was repealed, many people in the colonies were delighted. Some people wrote articles, letters, and songs expressing their gratitude. One woman, named Phyllis Wheatley, wrote a poem. Phyllis Wheatley was an enslaved African who had been brought to Massachusetts on a slave ship. She had gone to work in the home of a merchant named John Wheatley. The Wheatleys taught her to read and write. Eventually, she began to write poetry. A book of her poems was published in 1773. Her poem to King George became one of her best-known works. To the King's Most Excellent Majesty, 1768. Your subjects hope, dread sire, the crown upon your brows may flourish long, and that your arm may in your God be strong. Oh, may your scepter numerous nations sway, and all with love and readiness obey. But how shall we the British King reward? Rule thou in peace, our Father and our Lord. Midst the remembrance of thy favors past, the meanest peasants most admire the last. May George, beloved by all the nations round, live with heaven's choicest constant blessings crowned. Great God, direct and guard him from on high, and from his head let every evil fly, and may each clime with equal gladness see a monarch's smile can set his subjects free. The repeal of the Stamp Act. Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks was among the people killed during the Boston Massacre. Attucks was part African and part Native American. He had been enslaved, but at the time of the Boston Massacre, he was a sailor. During the crossfire, Attucks was shot in the chest and died immediately. 3 others, and eventually a 4th, also died as a result of the incident in Boston. On the day of the funerals, many shops closed. Thousands of people filed through the streets of Boston following the victims' coffins. Attucks and the others became heroes. The Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty was largely made up of small business owners. Several were merchants and tradesmen. The group got its name from an Irishman named Isaac Barr. Barr was a soldier and a politician. He spoke out in the British Parliament against some of the decisions being made regarding the colonies. Like George Washington, Isaac Barr fought in the French and Indian War. He was involved in the defeat of the French at the Battle of Quebec. He was strongly opposed to the taxes that were being imposed on the colonists. In one of his speeches, Barr referred to the colonists as Sons of Liberty. The name inspired some of the protesters in the colonies, and the group has been known as the Sons of Liberty ever since.